England's most realistic matchmaker, John Holt. I bring you this radio show every Saturday morning from 10 a.m. to noon, right here on 980 WXLM. If you want to call into the program, it's 860-442-WXLM, 860-442-9956. Now, my guest for the first hour today is Heidi Crockett. She's author of the book, The Neuroscience of Dating. You can also contact Heidi at her website at www.redlightheidi.com. redlightheidi.com. Welcome to the show, Heidi.
Thanks for having me.
How are you today?
I'm doing good. It's a good Saturday morning. How are you?
Good. So, Heidi, just let the audience maybe you can explain your background and let the audience know who you are.
Okay, so I'm a licensed clinical social worker, I'm a counselor, and then I have postgraduate training in sexual health and relationships from the University of Michigan. So I'm a relational neuroscience expert, so a general overview is I just say I'm a psychotherapist and I talk about stress and sex using relational neuroscience.
So can you explain, there was a great amount of research that went into your book. Can you explain just how much research went into writing this book?
Yeah, so when I use the words relational neuroscience, I'm talking about relational, interpersonal neuroscience, neurobiology. So there's a specific, if anyone listening wants to know more about this, they would just want to Google the word interpersonal neurobiology, which is a framework that was started by a neuropsychiatrist named Dr. Dan Siegel. So it's kind of like interdisciplinary science. It's based on over a dozen different disciplines of science. And I fell in love with it when I was in graduate school. And I wrote one book on caregiver stress on it and good mental health. And then I more recently wrote a book on good emotional health, which is the Neuroscience of Dating book. So people understand, I tried to take the principles of relational neuroscience and make it simple and fun and entertaining in the book.
So now, what drew you to this gentleman, Dan Siegel? What was the drawing point for that?
For me, the framework, and you'll see as we talk about it, it's like the principles make so much sense as you apply them in life. And so he kind of was the one who coined the phrase, but like interpersonal neurobiology, there's whole programs where you can get certificates in it. I mean, it's pretty growing in popularity. So I would say what drew me was the validity of the science that he uses and how much the framework made sense to me in terms of like explaining why people do what they do.
Well, that's really important because I mean my experience in the dating industry for now 25 plus years, and I've seen so many things. I mean, I guess I come down to this one area where dating is emotional. And some of the things that you explain in your book, have a lot to do with sort of these explanations for explaining why some of these things happen.
Yeah.
Which I found interesting because, there's a lot of things that I could sit there and say, well, yeah, I relate to this. I can relate to that. I've seen so many like this. I've seen so many that in terms of what different things that would come into my head as I was reading it. What is your view of the dating world in year 2017?
So for the listeners who don't know, my first book, Caregiver Stress, was written in memory to my husband. I was a caregiver for him. He had a brain tumor and he passed away in 2009. And I entered the dating world. And after 7 years, I did meet my partner 2 years ago. And, I say that I write my story in the book. And I wrote the book so that people could save time, basically, and money. I think that the current dating scene is, one of the principles in the book, I talk about a broken world and brokenness. And I think anyone in the dating world can identify with those principles. And the reason I wrote the book was to help people have like a toolkit to help them save time, because unfortunately there are a lot of broken people out there. But the point of the book is, how can I remain not broken? How can I be open and loving and sincere and seek to find and create that in my life while also protecting myself from this brokenness?
See, that's a great attitude, though, that you just projected to the audience.
Yeah.
Because, I deal with a lot of divorced people. And it's a determination that sometimes I make when I call it pre-screening, because when I'm a matchmaker, so
right.
I do pre-screening with people, especially those that are divorced. I have to try to determine whether or not someone is broken or somebody is actually really ready to get out into the dating scene, because really what they may possibly be ready for is therapy instead of the
Exactly. And I think what's happening is therapy is not seen as such a bad thing anymore, which is really good. And basically it grows your prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that thinks about thinking. It helps with narrative integration and interpersonal integration. So to get, quote, therapy is awesome and really good for a person's mental health, because they can reflect on their past and their future and their present goals. So there's nothing wrong with, I think that's changing, the idea of therapy. And then beyond that, what I like about dating is that our relationship, see, relational neuroscience, our relationship with dating, how we think of ourselves as a dating person in the dating world, is a reflection, like the microcosm and the macrocosm. It's a reflection of our relationship with life and with ourselves.
And it's important what you said about saving time and money, because there are people that go out there, and I've said this to people before. I said, don't keep throwing money into this idea or that idea of how to meet people. I said, until you're ready to do this and really ready to meet somebody, because if you do, you're just throwing money away, because you really don't know. There's a couple of things that I look at, where the first thing is self-awareness. Are you aware of who you are, first of all? And then the second piece of it is that, once you figure out who you are, then you then have to figure out who's attracted to you, and then who you are attracted to as well, and figure out how you fit inside of that, and in terms of finding somebody that's appropriate for you in the future. So a lot of it has to do with the fact of the matter is that people are either emotionally ready or they're not.
Yeah, which is why I begin the book with, I have this whole equation, but I start it with clarity, right? Like chapter 1 is clarity, and I talk about your boat, going down the river, your clarity boat, going down the river of brain integration, and really the starting point is how clear you are. Not that you have to 100% know everything you want, or because that can be kind of a form of rigidity, but just what you're describing in terms of that sort of reflecting inward, like, are you ready to really engage in the responsibilities of what it means to be in a partnership with another person?
Now, of course, the three-letter word sex.
Yeah.
What can you say to people about dishonesty and its correlation to sex?
Yeah, I have a chapter in the book. I'm ASECT certified as a sexuality educator, and I think and I talk about sexual safety in the book. I have resources too, because I think it's such an important topic, because there's dating to find someone who you're going to partner with for a very long time, and then there's people who are looking to have sex, and I just think there's different, and then there are people who are confused, if we want to categorize things. And so
I've met a lot of the confused.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times I view my role in that situation as the person willingness to listen to it and try to unravel the confusion.
Yeah, which is, I'm sure, a major thing that you help people do and that's part of the whole clarity. I mean, I wrote the book and people can read it, but achieving clarity is a process as well in and of itself. It's not something I say in the book. I said I can't write what that clarity is for you. So you're helping people get clear from the confusion. And we have hormones, we have needs. I mean, I could understand why people would be confused.
Now, did you hear the news that came out this week about STDs?
Yeah, I did. That the numbers are the highest reported ever.
Yeah, I mean that's a little bit scary. Although I guess the variety of what they were reporting were all curable stuff. So.
Yeah, it was gonorrhea, chlamydia, and one other one, and I think it was over 2 million cases were reported last year or something.
Yeah, because a lot of people are having unprotected sex in larger numbers right now. I mean, and there's I guess there's a correlation to dishonesty with some of that too, because if somebody actually knows. Although I would say probably there are people that don't even know. Where would you, if you had to put a guesstimate on this is just a guesstimate, but people who actually know they have it and go ahead and engage anyway, or is it more the majority just don't know they have anything?
I mean, I would say 100% of the people who are possibly engaging in this activity, they have some idea of a lack of responsibility. Because, if you have sex with someone and it just doesn't work. I mean, I can understand where people are coming from. They want to have fun. They don't, you don't want to have a difficult conversation. You don't want to go to the doctor's office and get tested for STDs. I mean, I could see why people take that route, but I would say 100% of the time, even if the person doesn't know whether or not they have an STD, they have an idea that they've had some form of unprotected sex. And if you have had unprotected sex, I think it's important to get a full panel and to be tested. And even if you are tested, you have to get tested 6 months later to make sure that you're not HIV positive.
That's true, yeah, because that could come up later on. You would test negative, and then all of a sudden maybe, later on down the line you would actually test positive.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting all this talk about sex because it really has to do with brain integration in my book, because there's like lower levels of brain integration where you're more in your animal, passion, limbic brain, emotions, that part. Then there's your prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain which is like a supercomputer that thinks about thinking. And of course, a book called The Neuroscience of Dating. I mean, the point of it is really just, can we think about this? Can we be a conscious being and make clear choices? And, sexual health is still one of those frontiers that we're not quite there yet as a culture in terms of really being conscious and comfortable with talking about it as a subject.
Well, my guest is Heidi Crockett. She's author of the book, The Neuroscience of Dating. We're going into a break right now. You're listening to Networking Singles on 980 WXLM. Conversation is the way to go. You want to make your date relax with you. Feel comfortable. Warm, inviting conversation. That's my suggestion to you when you're going out on first dates. Create that environment for which somebody feels comfortable, and you'll really get to know somebody better that way. I want you all to be careful out there how you reveal information about yourself, because smart people know that it's very wise to let information out in larger volumes when you really get to know somebody. You don't know who you're talking to really when you're first meeting somebody, so be very careful about that. I'm your host. I'm Southern New England's most realistic matchmaker, John Holt, with my guest, Heidi Crockett, who wrote the book, The Neuroscience of Dating. Heidi, tell people how they can get your book.
I think the easiest way is just to go to neuroscienceofdating.com and click on a link. It's there on Amazon.
Now, you talked in the book a little bit about admitting to mistakes that you made in your own personal dating choices.
This is true.
You made out there. I mean, there was a discussion, there was information in there about that. I mean, I guess it was a journey, right? It was a road of discovery.
It was a road of discovery, and part of it was that clarity that we were talking about. I probably had my own confused way of being in the beginning. Dating is a process of getting clear inside and then also just kind of figuring out what we're looking for, because relationships are kind of magical. I mean, you can try and look for someone who looks a certain way or whatnot, but what happens in the relating is unique.
You talked about the 9 functions of the prefrontal cortex.
Yes.
And can you go into some of that? There were some of the things that response flexibility,
Yep.
emotion regulation. You know what they are. So, could you go into some of those things and explain, a little bit about it?
I will. So there are 9 functions. There's a chart in the book, and they are empathy, insight, response flexibility, emotion regulation, body regulation, which has to do with like your central nervous system being regulated, morality, which is actually requires like higher functions of the brain to think about something larger than yourself, intuition, attuned communication, and then fear modulation, which is the ability to unlearn a fear. So I know that's a lot of information for people hearing, but the point is of those functions is that it requires higher functions of the brain to have them, and we can know about them, we can cultivate them in ourselves, and we can also screen our date for having these. And response flexibility is a good one that you mention. If someone has something happen on a date, are they able to respond flexibly, or do they become, rigidly upset very quickly?
All of these things are excellent, in my opinion, because, this sort of brought some clarity to me as a matchmaker when I'm looking at these and I'm saying, oh, wow, these are all things that I get concerned about
Yep.
when I'm matching people. And your book, sheds some light on this, and helps me a little bit as a matchmaker understand some things.
Right. Yeah. So one thing I really liked about what you just said is that, you don't want to say too much too soon. And, on the river of brain integration, I talk about when you have impaired integration, there's rigidity on one side and chaos on the other. And too much too soon is kind of like on that riverbank of chaos. You're not quite integrated. You want to be, you want to be connecting brain to brain with someone. You want to be relational. So if you're oversharing like a lot of information, you're not really relating in a comfortable way in that moment in time.
You use the key word relational. I use that word a lot.
Yep.
One of the things I feel like with the dating scene right now is I feel like there needs to be this giant decompression. I try to draw the intensity out of it, and start to say to people, men and women can have fun with each other initially. We get to know each other better as we feel more comfortable with one another when we relax and we're having fun, and we share information better that way than we do if we're all intense and we're being interrogated with 9,000 questions.
Right.
Things that go on. And, because, I always say to people, am I wrong? Dating should be fun, shouldn't it?
Absolutely. And again, that's when I said that your dating process, your relationship to dating is like a reflection of your relationship with life. Like, I think one should have fun with it. It can get cumbersome. I say that in the book. I can understand, but again, you don't want to be all rigid. You don't want to be on that riverbank of rigidity, overly rigid by only looking for one type of person, right? Then you could get kind of stuck. You're not actually in the aliveness, which is a natural part of just relating to another person and the mystery.
Well, there are some people out there who really, they look at dates as a way to, and they go into dates with this idea in their mind, I call it a sabotaging mind, with thinking, okay, what can we find out that's bad about this person? Well, I guess if you will something to happen, or if you ask enough questions, sooner or later somebody will answer a question the wrong way, in your point of view. And so, well, nobody's perfect, though.
Right, and I think that what you're describing to me would be a person who has maybe lower levels of brain integration, and they have more kind of limbic brain, black-white thinking, and they tend to see things in like one kind of rigid way.
That's true, because I've often heard my clients would say this to you if they were here. They would say, John is always telling us that the world is gray, it's not just black and white.
Yeah.
Because it is. I mean, there's no absolute things that go on with like somebody would say something about somebody, and I would say, okay, well, it doesn't mean that the next person you meet will be exactly like that one. So I caution people in dating not to stereotype, not to get into these sort of cookie-cutter ideas about people, because everybody's an individual.
Yeah, and that what you're describing is kind of response flexibility. Let's respond flexibly to each new person I meet. And you're also describing empathy, which is where you're kind of like, let's just investigate each new person and see kind of with an open-mindedness and explore who and what they are. When you're in the more limbic brain, you're kind of more fixed, like you think reality is one way and you know it. And that's what it's kind of a duller experience of life.
Well, actually, yeah, if you show genuine concern to a person that you meet, for whatever it is that they're saying, whatever the subject matter of the conversation is, that person is going to be more drawn to you as opposed to moving away from you.
Right. So, it's interesting. I feel like we're kind of describing, there's almost two levels of dating. One is kind of the nuts and bolts. So what is it you need to do and practical skills. And then there's another level, which is like, let's say you have two people who have more or less these 9 functions of the prefrontal cortex. They have empathy, they have response flexibility, and then they're not a match. Right?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's true.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's complicated, right?
Yeah, right? I say shame on me for ever sending them there if they weren't a match, right?
Well, you can meet, and I think that's part of good, healthy dating is that you have, first of all, you're not wasting your time, so you're screening people. So, like I talk about the 3-step time check in my book, which is where basically your first date is a video chat app, so you're not wasting time. But let's say you get to a point where you actually feel connected with the person and you have an in-person date. I think good, healthy dating is you can have a connection with someone, you can treat them with respect, but you can kind of come to the conclusion that it's just not like the right match.
Well, yeah, I mean, you get the people who just sit there and they didn't get a good vibe.
Yeah.
They just didn't get that feeling, and they won't even be able to tell you why in some cases. It's just some subconscious thing that went on, or it's just something that has to do with, and there are other people who will say, you know what, I really like this person, and I don't even know why.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think that's part of the mystery of dating too, and that love doesn't have to look any one way, and that sometimes we may end up being drawn to someone who doesn't fit the categories that our mind labels things as.
Well, there's things like oxytocin and...
Oh yeah, that. Which is why you want to be careful about getting sex involved too soon, because if you get all those feel-good chemicals, they can kind of interfere with the natural prefrontal cortex screening people in a healthy, logical way.
Well, that's true. You're absolutely right about that, because as we know, and I'm sure you know this as well, you have people who they got sexually involved with one another really early, and then later on it's like, you know what, I'm not feeling like I really like this person.
Oh, right.
Now what do I do?
We don't have as much in common as I thought we did once the infatuation kind of passes.
Well, I don't know if you see it this way or not, but we all know that males are visual.
Yeah.
We won't change that. Males are visual. Males, but and to a certain extent, that's part of what I call a piece of the pie. I think a lot of men out there think it's the whole pie, though, and they make all their decisions with their eyeballs. And I don't know how you feel about this, but I see this a lot.
Yeah, it's a lack of integration. It's interesting. A lot of the things you're describing is common sense, which is true. It's the same thing as like not being well integrated, right? So the person has this natural tendency. The man is very visual, but you just don't want to do all or nothing. You don't want to only use the criteria of your eyes to make a decision about who you're going to partner with.
Now, Now, attuned communication, tell us about this.
So this is really one of the hallmarks, I would say, of relational neuroscience, relating to other people, is the quality of the connection, like you're connecting to someone brain to brain. Attuned communication, it would occur, for example, when someone has, I don't know if you've ever heard of like attachment theory, someone who has a secure attachment, with a parenting figure when they are younger, they would have more, be more likely to be able to have this attuned communication. But everyone's capable of it. You're just connecting with someone, there's empathy, the person is like hearing what you're saying and reflecting it back. I mean, attuned communication basically just means there's a caring connection between two people.
And connection is really, really important to women.
It is. It's true. And men really care about the visual. I mean, if we're gender stereotyping. Now,
the limbic brain, fight, flight, fear. Responses, those kinds of things. Tell us about what the limbic brain does.
The limbic brain houses the emotions and the memories, and I always like to have, just think of it as like being in the middle of your brain, and the prefrontal cortex is kind of like where your forehead is, just to simplify things. And the limbic brain is like when you slam on the brakes in your car, you're in your limbic brain. Like sometimes you do that not even thinking about it. And it is intelligent and a wonderful part of our body. But what we want ideally is what's called vertical integration, where the limbic brain and the prefrontal cortex are properly integrated. And what that means is when you're stressed out, you can slam the brakes on the car, but then you're able to calm yourself down. You're able to what's called self-regulate. And then as you calm down, you're able to access response flexibility and empathy and higher functions of the brain, and then kind of make a conscious choice. Whereas what happens for some people is they get stuck in kind of like a feedback loop where they're really stressed out, and we all know these type of people, and they can't really get out of their own way. They're just so, there's a certain level of arousal, or intensity. It's a clinician term. It's not the good arousal. As a sex therapist, I just have to say that. It's just, there's a certain level of emotional intensity. You say to people on a scale of 1 to 10, how stressed out are you? If someone is like a level 7 or higher, they have what's called a high arousal level, which is they're probably in their limbic brain at that point in time. And it's not a good place to be. It's not the type of place you want to be on your first date, and it's not, where you want to be like a lot of the time.
One of the things that was mentioned in thinking, how safe am I, or do people really want me? Those are things that I think really go into because the part about the do people really want me has to do with this rejection.
Yes.
People have terrible time dealing with rejection. Either if they have to give rejection or they are on the receiving end of it.
Yeah, in relational neuroscience, actually, they've done studies that's shown that when people experience rejection, it lights up the same part of the brain that where you get stabbed. So I was like, wow, some of this stuff when I learned it, I was like, oh, so some people, rejection is one of those things that's extremely difficult for them. And, for other people it's not, but for some people it is.
Well, a lot of times the fear of thinking that a person might be safe, I mean, I've dealt with this with a lot of women. I keep telling men, women are going no place fast, I said, until they feel safe.
Yeah, this is true.
Feel safe with the guy that they think they're going out to meet. They're going to stay in their safety zone until and never leave their house until they decide that it's almost 100% surety that they'll be safe. And because of the world we live in, I don't blame them for that.
Yeah, and you're describing like the limbic brain in this chart where I compare the prefrontal cortex and the limbic brain. I say the limbic brain kind of sees the world thinking every 4 seconds, am I safe? Do people want me? Yeah, am I safe? Do people want me? That's kind of like the world of the limbic brain.
That's very interesting stuff. My guest is Heidi Crockett. You are listening to Networking Singles on 980 WXLM. We'll be right back. Capacity to attract people is what smart people do. They know that there is an intellectual component in matching. And this is where we really start to get to know somebody and just how intelligent they might be. Intelligence is attractive to certain people out there. Well, then people say, well, and dating can be so hard, you know. I hear this all of the time. When people, despite the feeling that it's really difficult, but the problems that people struggle with in dating, you know, to some people sound pretty trivial, but really, in fact, it's very important. To attractive people, you know, being able to communicate effectively sometimes could feel impossibly complex to others, but some people have an easy time with it. Does it sound so simple? Well, then why is it so hard? I've heard a lot of people say this to me. Why is it so hard, John? Well, you know, dating advice often compares improving one's dating life to improving at some practical skill, such as playing the piano or learning a foreign language of some kind. Generally speaking, if somebody practices enough, well, then they get better at it, don't they? I'm your host, Southern New England's most realistic matchmaker, John Holt, every Saturday on 980 WXLM, Networking Singles. My guest is Heidi Crockett. She wrote the book, The Neuroscience of Dating. Heidi, explain interpersonal neurobiology. Wow.
I know, right? It's a mouthful. That's why I use relational neuroscience, and people have a little more of a framework when they hear that. So it is a map of the mind. It's a way to understand one's own mind and the minds of other people and how to relate to those minds, internally and externally.
Now, this has to do, I would assume, with the emotional map that you know, that people start from childhood and move on, right?
This is true, you know, and I mean, we can always take a step back and think of how do I relate internally with myself? How do I relate to other people? And the 9 functions of the prefrontal cortex that we spoke about, some of the other tools from the framework are just ways to kind of quantify and understand the mind, which is invisible, and so thus harder for people to kind of grasp.
What determines how our needs are met, or the determination that they have not been met?
What determines like our needs, like in dating, whether or not they're met?
Yeah, connection with you know, relational connection with people.
Yeah, I think part of it has to do with our own expectations. What kind of expectations do we bring? And then part of it has to do with the level of brain integration that other person has. Because we can show up somewhere and like on a date and go to the bathroom, and then the date can leave, or, you know, and that can dash our expectations, and we can have an emotional response to that. So how do we self-regulate in the face of that? But then also that person obviously does not have good mental and emotional health for them to just leave without having like a regular conversation. Hey, I'm uncomfortable, I'm going to leave now. So, you know, we're dealing with the brokenness of the world in a way with getting our needs met.
Now, all human beings meet so many people over the course of their lifetime, starting from childhood right up to, you know, today in the present. Where do the experiences that are brought to people that they have no choice when they meet somebody, the person's bringing an experience to them?
Yeah.
Over time, how does this affect some of the things that you're talking about in your book?
Well, when we show up and we meet someone and we are aiming for that attuned communication, we don't know the level of brain integration that other person has. We don't know the types and qualities of relationships that they had growing up. But what we can do is that we can pay attention in our body in present time to how we feel when we're relating to another person. And what this relational neuroscience tells us is that, for example, intuition is actually actually something that's validated by science. So what that is intuition is a term that denotes the non-logical knowing that emerges from the body, especially the neural networks in the heart and the intestines that send their signals upward through the insula to regions of the middle prefrontal cortex. So we have these functions in our brain like intuition, which can help us in the moment sense how is this person's ability to relate to others. There's this non-logical knowing that we can actually tap into.
People get concerned with me sometimes because I say to them, this is a major process. And out of the major process, it takes a lot of time. I said, every once in a while I get this match where like two people signed up with my service, and it's like in the same week and they end up with each other. But that's far the exception to the rule. And I tell people sometimes you meet hundreds of people and only fall in love with a few.
Yeah, and the advantage of this process of dating and what people are engaging with you, they're relating to you, John, and then they're dating other people. It's all really good and healthy for the brain. So the whole point of relational neuroscience is talking about this invisible nourishment that comes through relating. And the way I kind of quantify it is there's this study, it showed like when seniors retire and they stop all social groups at age 65, that they have an increased 12% risk of mortality. So the reason I mention that is this relating to people, even going through the steps and practicing going on dates, it's good for the brain. It's like going to the gym for your brain.
Now, what's vertical integration?
So vertical integration is, we've got the 9 functions of the prefrontal cortex, and we have the 9 domains of integration, and they're just different types of integration. It's just ways that you can make your brain smarter. And so vertical integration has to do with the central nervous system, vertical like up your spine, and has to do with competing functions of the nervous system coming together and working optimally. So we mentioned before the limbic brain, which is kind of where the fight, flight, freeze response is. And then there's higher functions of the brain like the prefrontal cortex, like empathy and intuition. And so vertical integration is being able to access the appropriate parts of the nervous system when it's necessary.
Now, can you talk to people about rigidity?
Yeah, rigidity. Rigidity is a red flag, I would say. But
Heidi, please talk to a lot of people I know about rigidity. Please. Thank you to do that.
it isn't. If you look at studies on how to grow neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, it's all about learning new things, doing new things. If you always open the door with your right hand, open the door with your left hand. If you always drive to work one way, drive to work a different way. You create new neural pathways by doing that. So rigidity is like the opposite of that. And what it is this energy conservation. Because we repeat certain things without having to think about it. It's because if we thought about every single thing we do, we'd be thinking about 2 million things every second, and our brain would become overloaded. So there are moments in time when rigidity is a useful part of our brain, but if it gets in the way of us growing and learning and relating, that's when it's a problem.
A lot of women have said to me, they go out on dates, and I'll say to them if they're not interested in the person, I'll hear this more frequently. Well, he's not emotionally available. They came to that determination somehow, and that I hear that quite a bit. So tell us about availability in dating. What does this really mean?
So, well, I would say if someone, this is a problem with words too, right? You have to get the person to explain what exactly they mean by that. I mean, I could guess if oftentimes you'll see some men and women too, but we're talking about men, they'll be more in their left brain. They may be a lawyer, kind of more alpha type. They maybe are a CPA, where they're logical, they're linear. Maybe their emotional expression is a little more flat. And so on the date, maybe they're have Asperger's kind of a little bit, maybe they're low on the spectrum. And so on a date, what the woman might say is, they didn't really seem to be very emotionally aware. And so, if a woman is looking for emotional connectivity, that could be like a turnoff.
Now, one of the things I found interesting in the book was something called the useful aspects of chaos.
Yes, and rigidity, yeah.
And that's interesting. Useful aspects of chaos. One would think, oh my God, chaos. How could anything be useful there?
That's funny. And I had a person from Ireland say that when they heard the word chaos, they thought someone who was like chaotic, like someone who was crazy. So it's funny how these words kind of relate to different things. Within that, I talk about first half and second half. In the book, it's like a soccer field. And, I'm talking about this river of brain integration and the riverbanks of rigidity and chaos. So I talk about on the soccer field, the good aspects of rigidity and the good aspects of chaos. So you don't want to be too rigid, you don't want to be too chaotic, but there's certain things that are important. So like, for example, I say at the beginning of dating, it's important to have some rigidity where you're discerning and you're investigative, just like what you said about how you don't reveal too much information too quickly. That's like kind of I call it the first half. And then the second half of dating, which I say are the good aspects of chaos, is where you begin to open up and be more vulnerable, and that's a little chaotic if you think about it.
Well, of course. I mean, people are generally curious, I guess, about the person that they're with. Of course, they come a lot of times with preconceived notions. I always have said to people who have problems with that, is I say to them, try to do an exercise where you just clear your mind of whatever in the world happened in the past. Now, I know that's easy to say that, then it could be actually done. But I believe that. I say clear the mind. Don't think in terms of whatever happened to you in past relationships.
Right.
Go in there with that clean slate. And then just be curious about things that people say, and then add to the conversation, so then we have a flow.
Yeah, I mean, curiosity is way up there with gratitude in terms of helping like the brain improve in its function. I think you can't really go wrong with approaching a situation with curiosity and open-mindedness. The question is, when do we need to make sure that we're protected and safe, right? I mean, I think we can't open to that sense of curiosity, like you said, until there's a certain level of safety. Once the safety has been established, though, then we should definitely go into a situation with curiosity.
Yeah, because as time marches on, if we can't move from closed to open-minded, intimacy will not be possible in a healthy way.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's almost like when you're going in there and you're curious, you're saying to the world, I am open to the mystery of love. You do have to, no one's perfect. You're going to be relating to someone who has participated in the brokenness of the world. There is going to be some brokenness in that person, and you got to be willing. We all have a little bit of brokenness.
Oh yeah, no, you're on Earth for a while. Some of that, there's no question about that. Now, on every dating profile in the world and every questionnaire that I have in my filing cabinets, the word honest is in there I don't know how many times. How do we determine, or maybe you can speak to the determination of how somebody really figures out they're dealing with an honest person?
Yes, I mean, I definitely, when I talk about brain integration and using these relational neuroscience principles, kind of a core component I would hope someone would get out of the book is that you can improve your own level of brain integration, and you can learn how to screen your date for their level of brain integration. And I mean, of course, you can't always screen out for someone who's being dishonest if someone wants to be dishonest. But you can look for signs where they're not integrated, or you can trust your intuition. And I just think that with time, oftentimes these things start to become revealed. So what the person would need to do is not make themselves overly vulnerable in the beginning, because it takes time for certain things to be revealed.
So for those of you out there that want to bring clarity, Heidi's going to tell you exactly how to get that book again.
Yeah, just go to neuroscienceofdating.com.
Heidi, I appreciate you coming on this radio show. I mean, you're obviously a very intelligent person. You wrote a book of interest. It was really, really good. And I wish you well with the book. I mean, just briefly, we only have a couple of minutes, but I mean, has it been a real adventure with the book? How's it going with the book?
It's been an adventure, yeah. I wrote it. I think I self-published the book. I made that decision, and I think it's really just a matter of who happens to hear it, who happens to know about me. I've had people buy the book because I say, oh, by the way, it's just a book to understand good emotional health applied in the dating world. So I've had people just buy the book being interested in the relational neuroscience principles, above and beyond that. So as a psychotherapist, I think it's more word of mouth when people hear about it. And I did want to mention one thing for people listening, because you're up there in the tri-state area. The book is dedicated to this principle called couple enlightenment. And that came out of this enlightened person that I know named Dave O'Shaughnessy. And he is actually going to be in Maine, in Portland, Maine, on October 19th, just one day. He usually lives in Finland. So for anyone listening, if you're interested in spirituality, check out Dave O'Shaughnessy on October 19th.
Great. Heidi, you did a great job. I applaud you for the information that you supplied to our listeners today. Thank you so much for coming on.
You know what? You asked great questions, John, and I think your common sense approach to dating, I think it totally expresses these principles of relational neuroscience. You don't have to know all the principles just to live out the common sense and give the good dating advice that you do. So thank you so much for having me on the show.
I appreciate that, Heidi. We probably, maybe somewhere down the road, we'll have you back on again.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Have a wonderful day.
Welcome.